Hey there everyone, Nicole here, and I'm going to show you some photos I took in Iceland of a waterfall. Now this is Skógafoss, and I can remember seeing this waterfall 15 years ago in a random video and thinking to myself that I have to go to Iceland. This is just spectacular. It's like nothing I've ever seen before. And just this summer, I was finally able to go. Now we rolled into Iceland the mid-afternoon or so. We rented our camper van and we were exhausted. So one of the first things we did was we drove straight out to this waterfall. We parked in the parking lot or the camping area and we went to sleep. We took a pretty good nap. And then as the sun started to set, we woke up, we made some coffee, and we went out with our cameras and walked over to the waterfall and started photographing it. We had a pretty good sky, thankfully. Sometimes it's tricky. Iceland can be a little fickle with its weather, but this was a really good start to our photography, and we were able to actually get some nice pretty clouds with a beautiful sunset in the background. Now you can see with these photos, I was pretty much shooting into the light, so I couldn't get one photograph with everything at the proper exposure with just that one frame. So what I did was I would take one image where I exposed for the waterfall and the foliage and everything around it, and then I would take another photograph with the sky being exposed properly. Now this is a vantage point that I really liked. I was actually able to frame the waterfall with this little nook right here, and I thought this was neat because it kind of looks like a face if you zoom up kind of close to it. But there were a few other spots that we photographed from as well. And I can show you this is at the top of it or near the top of it. That's me and my husband after we had done all our photography. And then I also have a panorama that I put together so you can see what it looks like from that spot that I just showed you. Now all of these photographers down here, they arrived shortly after we did, and that's where I was standing for that photograph that I just showed you. And that photograph is going to be the one I'm going to process. So, and you can even see out here, this is where all of the campers are parked and everyone's sleeping for the night because it's pretty late at night. It's probably about 10 or 11 p.m. So I'll go back into grid view and I'm going to go back up to those two photographs. And these are the images that I would like to work with. I'll go ahead and throw them side by side in survey mode. I just have them highlighted and I'm going to hit that N key. So what I'm going to do with these photos is first I'm going to do some basic processing here inside of Lightroom. Then I'm going to take them into Photoshop where I'm going to take the sky from the right and put it into the photograph on the left. Then I'll bring it back into Lightroom and do some last minute refinements and then we'll be done. So I'll hit escape to get out of the survey mode and then I'm just going to hit Command D to deselect those and then I'll just reselect this main image here and then hit the D key to go into that develop module. I'm going to go ahead and toggle this sidebar on the left. I don't really need that visible while I'm working here. So the first thing I'd like to do with this photo is I want to adjust the white balance. I want to make sure that the base colors of this image look as perfect as possible. It's kind of tough sometimes when you have a lot of one color. For example, I have a lot of green in this image, but I look at the photo and I know that there's too much green as an overall color, not just because there's green moss and green plants. So the first thing I actually need to do is go into that basic panel and I'm going to increase that tint. So I'm going to add some magenta to it. It's at 16 right now, and that's what it was like as shot. But as I move it to the right, and if I move it too far, you can see that kind of magenta pink hue is showing up in the mist there. I don't want to go that far. I'm going to bring it down closer to around 30, so I have it like 29. And then I'm just going to toggle that preview on and off using that / key so I can see a quick preview. And I can see how I'm bringing some of those original colors back into the scene. Now I'm going to go up to the temperature, and I think it needs a little bit of warmth to it. There's a little bit of blue I can see kind of overall there. So I'm going to take that warmth slider and move it to the right. Sometimes I like to go too far. I like to push it too far just to see how far I don't want to go. And then I back it up a little bit, and that usually gets me to a pretty good spot. So I'll toggle that before and after. I think I might move it back just a little bit more. And there we go. So that's a pretty good start to everything here. Now I'm going to go into the exposure. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to bring those highlights way down. Now I have a little bit of sky visible here. I don't really need it to be that far down. I can actually move that highlights back up a little bit, but it did bring some of the detail in that water, which is really nice. So I'm also going to increase the contrast. Not too much though. I'll take that shadows. I have some pretty dark areas here on the right and over here on the left. So if I move that shadow slider to the right, it should fill in some of that. And I'm going to go up to the exposure. I don't want to increase the exposure too much, maybe just by 0.2 there. That's probably a good number there. And the escape key will get me out of that setting. Now I'm going to go down and see what would happen if I move the white slider around. I'm not really sure if I need to, but I'm just going to see what happens if I play with it. Now is a good time to actually make these adjustments and get as much done as possible because I'm working on a RAW file. I've converted everything to DNG, so all of my edits here are non-destructive. So I'm going to do as much as I can here before moving things into Photoshop. So I'm going to move that white slider and push it far to the right, to the left. If I move it to the left, it gets everything a little too flat, and moving it to the right makes the sky a little too bright. I don't want the sky to be overly bright. I'd like to limit the amount of haloing that I have and basically limit the amount of work that I have to do to remove any type of haloing when I'm actually doing the masking in Photoshop. So I don't want to push that really to the right. If anything, I'm just going to move it slightly to the left just to kind of reduce the contrast a little bit because I can always bring contrast back. And same with the black. Let's see what happens if I move those blacks. Moving it to the right flattens the image, and I don't want that, and I don't want to add any blacks, so I'm just going to get that back down to 0. Now let's just do a quick before and after toggle. I always like to get a good kind of status update of what I'm working on, just so I can see if there's anything I need to go back and make any adjustments to. Now I have the presence, which is the clarity, vibrance, and saturation sliders. I'm not going to do anything with the clarity right now, but I am going to play with the vibrance and maybe even the saturation. I want to always be careful that I don't oversaturate my landscape photographs. It just kind of cheapens them, and it can really make them look amateur by just blowing the vibrance or the saturation. As you can see, if I move that all the way to the right, things are getting a little too overcooked. So if anything, I might move it a little bit to the right. So I have that set to about 15. I think I might move that saturation slider in the opposite direction just to kind of balance things a little bit. And now I'll do another toggle before and after. Things are looking great. Okay, now I have this other image here at the bottom, and I would like to make a few adjustments to it. If anything, I'm going to change the white balance, and I'm going to see what it looks like if I sync the white balance settings from the previous image. So I'll go ahead and start on this image. I'm going to hold that Shift key and then click the image there in that film strip. Click on Sync in the bottom right. I'm going to check, I'm going to check None. And then I'm just going to sync that white balance. And let's see, maybe I'll even sync the color because that will also sync those two, that vibrance and that saturation. So I'll go ahead and click Synchronize. Deselect those real quickly, and let's go over to that. And let's do a quick toggle before and after and see what it did. Looks like it made it a little too magenta, which is what we were going for with the other image. Well, not too magenta, but fixing it with magenta. And this one's a little bit overdone. So I'm going to move that tint slider to the left to kind of bring it back kind of to where it was. Okay, I'm going to go back to that main image. I'm going to kind of play with one last thing before I jump into Photoshop. I'm going to go into the camera calibration panel. Now I'm going to select landscape. I'm going to see what this does. It actually does some pretty nice things. It gets a little too saturated for my taste, so I'm going to go back into some of these sliders. I'll go into the green primary. If I move that saturation all the way to the left, you can see it really pulls a lot of that saturation out. But if I maybe keep it about halfway, and I can even just toggle that panel to see what it did. But I really do like what it did. It added a nice little kind of punch to the photo. So I'll go ahead and leave that. I'll leave that setting intact. Now I'm ready to take these into Photoshop. I'm going to hit G to go to my grid view, and then I'm going to hold that Shift key and make sure that I have both of those photos selected. Then I'll go up to Photo, Edit In, Open as Layers in Photoshop. Now you can see over in the Layers panel, I have both of those images as a separate layer. I have the sky below, and then I have the image that was exposed for the foreground on top. What I'd like to do is remove this washed out sky so that way the sky below is showing through. So I'll do that through masking. I'll start by selecting that quick selection tool over in the toolbar. I'll increase the size a little bit using that right bracket key. And then I'm just going to sweep across until the sky is selected. Now I'll add a mask using the Add Layer Mask icon. I'm going to hold that Option or Alt key though at the same time, and that will reverse the mask as it's being added. Now we can see that darker sky showing through. The edges of the mask need a little bit of work though, so we're going to go ahead and do that using this Properties panel over on the right. I'm going to move my Layers panel actually, so it's kind of in line with all of these things. I'll bring that Properties panel out because we're going to be doing a lot of work with this. Let's go ahead and collapse some of these panels over here so we just have only a few things that we're working on. There we go. Now the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to play with the density slider. Now the density slider will only affect the layer mask, and it basically is like an opacity slider. Right now the default is at 100%, but if I scroll it to the left, you'll see that the sky goes kind of back to the way it was. And if you look at the mask in the Layers panel, that black area is now very light gray. So I'm just going to go ahead and move it a little bit further to the right. What I'm going for is, as you can see at 100%, it's a little overpowering, and I think that it looks a little too unrealistic because the sky should be slightly washed out, just so it blends a little bit better with the actual image. So I'm just going to reduce it down, maybe at about 75%. I think that's a good starting point. Now if I zoom into some of these areas, I'll zoom into 100% real quickly. You can see that there's a halo going on, kind of a harsh, unwanted edge there that really makes it look like I dropped a different sky in. So what I need to do is blend those a little bit more cleanly, and I'm going to do that using the mask edge here in the Properties panel. So first I need to make sure that I'm seeing the proper view. I want to select the On Layers, which will show me all of the layers in the Layers panel as I'm actually making these adjustments. The first thing I'm going to adjust is the feather. I'm going to move the feather to the right. And you can see it's adding a little bit more of a halo there. So then what I'll do to kind of correct for that is shift the edge, which will actually shift it into the foreground image. Then I'll go back to the feather and just kind of adjust that and increase it even more. I can maybe move that shift edge back a little bit closer to center. That did a really good job of feathering that harsh transition so that the sky and the foreground look a little bit more realistic. I find when I'm doing things like this that it's usually pretty good for me to literally move my eyes away from the screen and then look back at it. Because sometimes when you're making changes, I know exactly what I did to this photo, so I can look and see that, oh yeah, maybe I made some adjustments to the edge there, I dropped a new sky in, but I kind of have to reset my perspective by looking away from the screen and then just kind of getting a fresh look at it. That way I don't really see those edits as clearly. But I think this is a pretty good place to stop with that Refine Mask Edge. So I'll go ahead and click OK. Now I'd like to just do some manual refinement to this mask, and I'm just going to use the brush tool to do that. So I'll press the B key, and that will bring me into that brush mode. At the top, I have my opacity set to 20%, and that's a good place to start. I'm going to increase my brush size a little bit and make sure that I have a very nice feathered brush. You can see the hardness there is set to 0. I'm also going to make sure that I'm painting with white because I want to bring back some of the original image into this mask. And now I'm just going to do a slight brushing over the edges. It's very, very, very subtle adjustments that I'm doing here. If it were too harsh, then I would start to see the brush strokes, and I don't want that to happen. So I tend to use a lower opacity brush and then just make several brush strokes over the same spot if I need to. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and stop here with the masking. I think that things are looking pretty good. So I'll just go ahead and save this image. I'll just do a Command or Control S, and then I'll just close the file. And if I go back into Lightroom, you'll see it appear there alongside my other two images. I'll go ahead and go into the Develop module with this image by clicking the D key. I'm also going to hide the film strip at the bottom so I have a little bit larger, more real estate on the screen to work with the image. Now, one thing I noticed when I was in Photoshop is that I have a little bit of chromatic aberration here that I missed apparently when I was doing my raw processing. So I'm going to go into the lens correction setting. I'll click on Color, and then I'll click on Remove Chromatic Aberration. That did an okay job. I think I'm going to slide the amount slider to the right a little bit to try and pull a little bit of that color out just to make sure that none of it is really showing. Let's go ahead and check the entire edge and see how it looks over there. Okay, so that chromatic aberration is gone. Now, if you notice, there's little white specks in the image. Those are actually little birds that live and are kind of nesting there behind the waterfall. I thought that was really interesting when I was photographing it. They were just flying around. Okay, so back to editing. Now I'm just going to do some final touches to this image here inside of Lightroom. I really like to use Lightroom to kind of finish my images. I think that it does a really great job. So I'll go up to the basic panel, and I'm just going to click that auto button to see what it thinks it should look like. Now it brightened the image a little too much, so I'm going to move that exposure slider kind of back down closer to 0. Set it to 0.25 there. I'll toggle that before and after to see what we have going on. I'm going to move the highlight slider to the left a little bit. Maybe not too much though. What I'd like to do is darken the area at the top. So what I'll do is add a graduated filter. I'll click it over in the little tool options there on the top right. And then I'll just drag down. It didn't make any changes because I had not set any of the sliders yet. So now as I move, let's try the exposure. We'll start out with exposure, move that to the left. I'll move that white slider to the left. And I'm going to increase the clarity as well. Now I'll just toggle this setting on and off. I like what it's doing, but if you notice, it's also adding the effect to some of the areas that I really don't want it to change. And it looks like it might be a little too much because I'm starting to see some of that halo return around this rock area. So I'm going to bring that exposure back closer to 0, like minus 0.35 I have it set there. I'm also going to move the gradient up a little bit as well and just kind of rotate it around a little bit. I think I'm going to play with the temperature sliders too. That way I can just adjust the sky. So if I move it to the left, it makes it a little bit more blue. To the right makes it more yellow. I think I'm going to go towards the right just a tiny bit just to warm that sky. And I'm just going to see what the tint slider does if I move it around as well. Now I don't think I want to change the tint. I'll just leave that as is. I can even increase that saturation too. Too far to the right. It's actually not making that much of an adjustment, so I'll keep it at about 30. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to fix these two little rock areas here. Still inside this gradient tool, I'm going to click on that brush option there on the right. I'm going to make sure that erase is selected, and then I'll just paint over those areas. Now it's kind of hard to see what I'm doing, so if I hit that O key on my keyboard, I can actually get a preview of the mask, and I can see where I'm actually removing it. I'm going to make sure that I have a much smaller brush up here. I'm also going to check that auto mask in the settings. And I'm just going to keep it kind of to the inside portion. I don't want to get too close to the edges because I don't want to reinforce any of the halo. I'll go ahead and hit O to hide that. Let's go ahead and toggle this on and off. It still looks a little too harsh for me. I'm just going to move it up a little bit. I really want to avoid the halos on the edges. That's kind of the biggest thing that I want to make sure that I'm very conscious of. So you know what I think I'm going to do is I'm going to uncheck that auto mask because I still see some over on this side. I'm going to increase the brush size and make sure that my flow is pretty low. So I'll kind of move that down to around 25 or so. And now I'm just going to brush over the edges over here. Go to O and see what my mask is doing. Just to kind of blend this area in together a little bit better. Okay, I think that did a pretty good job. Let's go ahead and toggle that on and off. This is a very, very subtle adjustment. Okay, now what I'd like to do is make some edits to the waterfall, just some selective edits. So I'm going to collapse that gradient tool, and I'm going to select the brush tool. I'll go ahead and click O just so I can get a preview of the mask as I'm drawing. And then I'm going to reduce that brush size. Now I'll paint over the waterfall. I'll press O to hide that mask. And what I'd like to do is make the waterfall look a little bit more textured. So I'll go ahead and increase the clarity and the contrast. And I'll move the highlight slider to the left. And let's go ahead and toggle this and see what it looks like. All right, that did a pretty good job of really bringing that waterfall out. Click on the brush at the top to collapse the panel. Now let's do a full preview of before and after. Next, I'm going to go into the tone curve, and I'm going to select medium contrast to add some contrast into the image. The dark area's got a little too intense, so I'm going to take that dark slider and move it back to the right just a little bit. I'm going to toggle this panel on and off. Things are looking good. Now I'm going to go into the split toning. I oftentimes will like to add a very subtle split tone. I don't want to make the photo look like it's cross-processed or that the colors are funky. I just like to kind of add a little bit more color to the image overall. I usually start out by adding a yellowish highlight. So I'll just select somewhere in that yellow range, and then I'll increase the saturation. And you can see if I push it to the right really far, then the highlights really start to get warm. But I'll just kind of move it to the right just a little bit. And then for shadows, I'm going to select a blue tone, and then I'll move that slider to the right. Again, I don't want to go too far. I just want a very slight, subtle blue. I could even increase the yellow saturation a little bit. Now I'm going to go back up to the basic panel because I'm kind of looking at this and realizing I do want it to be a little bit cooler. So I'm going to go into this temp slider and just move it towards the left just a little bit. I'm also going to go down to the vibrance and increase the vibrance. I never want to go too far with the vibrance. You can obviously see how cooked the image can get if you move it too far to the right. So I'll usually go about 20 or so. Let me go ahead and just do a preview on and off. Make sure it's not looking too over the top. And I'm even going to reduce that saturation a little bit as well. I'm going to increase the vibrance again. I like to split those two, increasing the vibrance and then slightly decreasing the saturation. All right, I'm really liking how things are going here. So I'm going to go down to the effects, and I'd like to add a vignette, a post-crop vignette. So I'll start out by reducing the amount, and I usually go more than I want to when I reduce the amount slider at the beginning because I want to be able to see what the other sliders are doing, and if the amount is too subtle, then I can't always see the changes. I'd like to push the midpoint in just a little bit. I usually like the feather to be pretty high, so I'll move that up about 89–90%. And I don't think I want it super round. Let's see if it's really round. Makes it like a circle, and then if you go to -100, it kind of squares things off. So I think I'm going to go at like -45. I could even move that midpoint in a little bit more. Now I'll go and take that amount slider and move it closer to 0. It's about -27 right there. I'll toggle this on and off. So you can see that did make a pretty good change. And now I'm going to see what the other style settings do. Right now it's defaulted at highlight priority, but if I go down to color priority, you can see it makes a kind of a little bit of a difference. And then paint overlay is usually one of my favorites. I'm actually going to decrease it a little bit with that setting. And let's see what that toggle, that before and after toggle does. Last but not least, I'd like to use the dehaze filter just a little bit to try and cut through some of that mist. I don't want to go too far. If I go too far, then it really kind of overdoes the whole image. So I'm just going to push this to about 10. Let's start at 0 again and see what it looks like if I move it up to about 10. And that did a pretty good job. It kind of cut through a little bit of that haze, a little bit of that mist to kind of show what's going on behind those rocks.